Taking a pulse, Iowa's economic heartbeat slowly recovering, but many are wondering how fast and how strong. We're asking two prominent Midwest academic economists, Creighton University's Ernie Goss and Iowa State's David Swenson, on this edition of Iowa Press.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Iowa Gaming Association, on behalf of 18 commercial casino members who employ over 9,200 people with an annual payroll of more than $276 million and who generated nearly $1 billion for Iowa's economy in 2011.
Iowa Bankers Association. Iowa banks provide financial services to meet the needs of families, farms, and businesses. More information is available online at myiowabank.com. Iowa Banks, your future, our focus.
The Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure. Iowa Community Foundations, an initiative of the Iowa Council of Foundations, connecting donors to the causes and communities they care about, for good, for Iowa, forever. Details at iowacommunityfoundations.org.
The Rotary Clubs of Iowa and Rotary International.
In 1985, Rotary International committed to a goal of ending polio worldwide. Very soon now, after immunizing over 2 billion children, the goal will be achieved. Rotary, humanity in motion.
Iowa's hospitals provide jobs to 74,000 Iowans and have a $6.1 billion impact to the state's economy. Read more at www.ihaonline.org. The Iowa Hospital Association. We care about Iowa's health.
Iowa's private colleges and universities, enrolling 25% of the total Iowa higher education enrollment and conferring 44% of the baccalaureate and 40% of the graduate degrees in the state. More information is available at www.thinkindependently.com. For decades, Iowa Press has brought you politicians and newsmakers from across Iowa and beyond. Celebrating 41 years of broadcast excellence on statewide Iowa Public Television. This is the Friday, January 13 edition of Iowa Press. Here is Dean Borg.
Iowa's unemployment rate, 5.7%, latest reported, about 3% lower than the nation's 8.6%, that's for November. Even so, the deep recession's effects are lingering in Iowa, just like families. Iowa schools, cities, state government have been cutting spending because tax revenues aren't back to where they were just after the turn of the century. Iowa's agricultural economy, good prices for corn, soybeans, pork, and beef, is being credited with cushioning the economic hit in Iowa. But Main Street Iowa, small businesses, including banks, are apprehensively evaluating economic indicators. We're asking two academic economists for their insights, Creighton University's Ernie Goss and Iowa State University's David Swenson. Welcome to Iowa Press.
Thanks. Good to be here.
And across the Iowa Press table, Associated Press senior political writer Mike Glover and Radio Iowa News Director Kay Henderson.
Mr. Goss, let's start with you. The state's budget is predicated on what the governor and legislative fiscal staffers see as a 4.5% growth in state tax collections, which would reflect a roughly 4.5% growth in the state's economy. Is that realistic?
It probably is. It might be a little on the optimistic side, meaning that the comparison numbers, that is, from 2011 2012, are going to be somewhat weaker than going from 2010 to 2011. So I think it's probably a bit on the optimistic side, given the numbers that we're seeing. We do two surveys of Iowa each month, but rural areas and urban areas, and both are telling us somewhat the same story, that the Iowa economy, the growth, is likely to be a bit slower. So I think, again, it's probably on the optimistic side.
Mr. Swenson, same question to you. The state's budget is predicated on a 4.5% growth in the state's economy. Is that realistic?
Well, I do think it's realistic. The reports from just the last fiscal report seem to show that revenues had picked up in December, that the pace and pattern of growth has picked up of late. Now, just a few months ago, it had flattened out, so it very well could be that they're on track to reach that target.
And Mr. Goss, what's driving this economy? I mean, the Dean talked in the intro about the recession, recession that's settled across the country. What's driving growth in Iowa?
A lot to do with farm income. Agriculture's very healthy, and that's one of the reasons I'm expecting a little bit of the growth to come down for 2012. I just don't think farm income is going to be quite, the growth rate is not going to be as strong.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, you've got growth in the global economy has been expanding fairly briskly. That's particularly in Asia and even in Europe. Now, both of those areas, growth is coming down as well. And finally, you've got a cheap dollar, and the dollar's rebounding. It's grown by about 5.3% over the last 2 months. With the growth in the value of the dollar, that tends to push agricultural commodity prices down. We're likely to see that. And likewise, of course, in my judgment, Europe's in a recession right now. And obviously, when you're in a recession, you buy fewer goods, and a lot of those goods come from us, America.
Same question to you. What's driving this economy and the growth here, as
Yes,
opposed
well,
to what you're seeing in
right.
Europe with recession?
We have the ag economy. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize, the ag economy is really important to the Iowa economy, but it's doing all it can right now. The remainder of the growth that's going to happen in the Iowa economy is dependent on what's going on in the rest of the world and the rest of the United States. What we make, we sell to them. How well they're doing is going to be how well we're doing. We don't have anything magical or insular that's going to drive more growth, significantly more growth. So we're very, very dependent on the health of the rest of the world.
It used to be said that Iowa was insulated from the world, that we were our own kind of economy. That's not the case?
No, it's not the case, and it's really never been the case. We have always followed the nation in recessions. In the 80 recession, 81 recession, we got just as, and it was just as bad in Iowa. What happened in the 90 recession, it didn't happen here, and a lot of people said, oh, we dodged that bullet, there's something magic about Iowa. But in the 2001 recession, we went into it a year longer. We stayed in it just as long as the nation did. It was a 5-year recovery. And in this recession, we went into it later, but we're staying down and flat, and we're not recovering quite as fast as we thought we might.
Kate? Let's focus a bit on some of the storm clouds that may be looming for the ag economy in particular. Land prices through the roof. And also, you have tax credits for the renewable fuels industry that are in doubt. I mean, what's to say that there won't be a farm crisis on the Iowa landscape similar to what happened in the 1980s?
It won't be like the 1980s, but some of the air will come out of the bubble, as I'm expecting this year, as what goes on in Europe. Again, the decline in demand there for agricultural commodities, but also just with the increase in the value dollar, which pushes down ag commodity prices, and likewise the increase in energy costs, which is likely to continue. All that is going to tend to moderate the growth in farmland prices. Remember when I was a kid, we talked about dirt poor. Dirt's not poor anymore. Dirt's dirt. In fact, farmland is the new gold. It has been. These growth rates are unsustainable. There is air in the bubble. The question is when the air is going to come out of the bubble. I expect some of it to come out in 2012, but not much.
Well, Kay used the word crisis. You don't see crisis. You see a slow recession.
Dean, when the ag land purchases now are a lot to do with cash. This is not over-leveraged farmers who are borrowing from the bank to buy the land, which is based upon a significant growth rate. That's not what we're seeing. But that said, I still expect some of the air to come out of the bubble because of potentially higher interest rates and lower agricultural commodity prices.
Mr. Swenson, I mean, what's the impact also of these declining and sometimes disappearing tax credits for renewable fuels? Because that's been driving commodity prices.
Well, it's been driving commodity prices. I'm not an ag economist, but in general, both the industry, the renewable fuels industry, as well as the ag economists are saying this. The elimination of the subsidy for ethanol isn't going to have that big of an impact on both ethanol price as well as the prices received by farmers. Well, so because demand is maintained, and because demand is maintained, it provides a floor underneath of the prices of both ethanol as well as corn. So that part is going to be sustained. But there's other categories of renewable fuels. We have the wind energy industry. We have our expectations perhaps for advanced renewable fuels. Well, we're not going to make any more corn ethanol. That has maxed out. We may make some more advanced renewable fuels, as in cellulosic ethanol, ethanol, but that is going to take a while to take off. And the expiration of the production tax credits for the wind energy is something that has got some people worried that we may see less investment in that down the road.
Isn't your argument that you just made about ethanol subsidies an argument that ethanol subsidies were never really needed?
I don't think it was an argument that they were never needed. That it was a multi-pronged approach to promote this industry, and that they both required subsidies and depended on subsidies at the production level. They also required mandates. It was a phased thing to try to ensure this industry and to protect those capital investments. Whether they were ever really needed or not, I think we're going to just have to let history judge that, and it's already too late because we had them and now they're gone.
Mr. Cross, your comment?
Yeah, but a lot of it depends on the price of oil, of course. And oil, as oil gets more pricey, and I expect it to, the expectations are, and it depends on, of course, the Middle East, and who can predict that. I don't know the conflicts in the Middle East, but most those who are more familiar with it than I are predicting higher prices. Well, that does help ethanol. And if we saw prices back to $40, $50 a barrel, now they're double that right now, more than double, then that would put pressure on the ethanol industry. Likewise, we've had Brazil's had problems in their ethanol industry in terms of their production costs, so they become less competitive. So right now, the margins are real good in ethanol, corn-based ethanol, but that could change. That changes very quickly. I mean, back to Mike's point about is Iowa insulated from the global economy? No, Iowa's more connected than most economies around the U.S.
Given that, and given Mr. Goss and you have agreed that the current agricultural boon is unsustainable, is there something, and given the fact that Iowa's economy is somewhat cushioned by agriculture or strengthened, Mr. Swenson, is there something that state government should be doing or could be doing to ensure that, not that the boon continues, but that agriculture is considered also a business like we're incentivizing small businesses and commercial property? Should state government be doing something more than it is right now for agriculture?
Well, I don't know that state government can do much more to both promote and protect agriculture. It has been agriculture's biggest cheerleader, not only within the state and state policy development, but also in the development of national policy. It's got a myriad array of laws that help protect farm owners, family farm corporations, and help protect their productivity. So my short answer is no. I don't think there's much more that it can do.
I think there are some elements that Dave would probably agree with. I think is in encouraging trade. We've got the South Korean Trade Pact that was signed into law by the president this past few months last year, and that's going to be very positive. So I think we underestimate how important, say, Governor Branstad going to South Korea, taking along business folks, taking along agricultural industries to seal deals, and going to China, going to Indonesia, particularly where we're going to see growth in the emerging nations. I think now that's a market-based approach, and I'm more toward the market end of the economy.
Let me turn Dean's question on its ear a little bit, if I could. We hear a lot of talk in politics in the state, in state government, about the state ought to do this to fix the economy, the state ought to do that to fix the economy. Realistically, isn't there very little the state can actually do to influence what's going on?
In the short run, that's very, very true. But in the long run, I think absolutely there are some things. And what I would encourage is to have a competitive tax system. That's very important. And I'm saying competitive. Now, you're lucky that you're bordering states that are pretty uncompetitive. That would be Illinois and to some degree Minnesota. Missouri's more competitive. Nebraska's somewhat more competitive. That doesn't mean tax incentives. That doesn't mean tax giveaways. That means having an overall, broadly based, solid, competitive tax structure.
And you think Iowa has one?
I think Iowa's got some ways to go on that. I think there's some things that Iowa should be doing to make their tax system more competitive.
Such as?
Lowering the rate and broadening the base. I see too much in terms of incentives. I think you need to, we hear a lot of complaints, and obviously we all like to, as a matter of full disclosure, I own property in Iowa at a vacation spot in Iowa, so I pay property taxes. I don't pay Iowa income taxes. And I hear lots of talk about reducing my property tax. I think that's great, but let's focus more on the growth side. Let's look at income taxes. I think that's where Iowa has some competitive issues, lowering the income tax, the marginal income tax rate.
And let's go to you, David. What do you see as what the state can do, and can the state really have an influence on what's happening in the economy?
Well, if I'm going to look at what the state is supposed to do, and it's supposed to be an efficient deliverer of public goods and services, and that's part of an economy, not the enemy of the economy, is the production of government services. So having an efficient, effective, well-run state government, local government system is the hallmark, it's the foundation for economic activity. And so that should be a goal, and I think that is a goal for everyone. That the state has an uncompetitive or a competitive tax structure, we may become on a little bit different. I think we have a highly competitive, when you take all taxes together as a fraction of GDP, Iowa ranks quite well in the nation. We don't look bad. We might stand out on one or two particular elements, but we don't look bad across the board. We stand out we stand out on the commercial property tax. We also know that we stand out on the rate side, both with regard to our individual income tax as well as the corporation tax, because of federal deductibility. Ernie just said we need to lower the rates, broaden the base, we get rid of some of the distortions or the gimmicks, we make the system more predictable and perhaps more efficient.
Kate? Well, there's a lot of debate at the State House right now about specifically commercial property taxes, and Republicans, including our Republican governor, argue that lowering those rates will lead to job creation. Mr. Goss, is there a direct link between lowering commercial property tax rates and job creation?
I think you could make that linkage, but I think the rates, the corporate tax rates, are more important than property tax rates. So I would rather see work on that in that direction. Back in the 19th century, Henry George talked about the perfect tax. The perfect tax is a tax on land and not land improvements, so that there's not any distortions there as long as you administer only on the land. So property taxes, if you can do it properly, now that's very difficult to do, have less of a distortion on the economy. Now, we all live in this part of the country, and that's where the sensitivity is. And one of the reasons is, another reason I don't say I like property taxes, but I'm more supportive of that. You pay it in big blocks, so people have this sensitivity. Likewise, it's at the local level, so if you don't like it, you can go down to your county commissioners, your school board, and complain. It's harder to complain about when you have to come to Des Moines to complain.
What is your view about reducing commercial property taxes?
The whole thing has to be looked at as a package. We have very, very beneficial provisions for ag land, for residential properties. We've eliminated machinery and equipment for industries, but the commercial side doesn't get the same kind, just by virtue of how commercial property changes over time, does it end up getting the same kind of breaks. I think a comprehensive look at all payers of property tax, all classes of property, it would be part of this reform. Not just lowering commercial taxes, but actually addressing the entire property tax system.
Mr. Goss, one of the key elements we're hearing at the State House is the governor and legislative leaders both want to focus on overhauling the state's education system, and they see that as a driver for the state's economy. Are they wrong-headed about that?
No, they're absolutely right. I'm in the educational system. We rarely get scrutinized, and when you call for any scrutiny of educational expenditures, you're anti-education, you're anti-kids, and that's K through 12, that's university education. We talk about healthcare being a problem because we spend so much, and we talk about education being very solid because we spend so much. Now, which is it? I think scrutiny is absolutely essential there, and we're going to have more scrutiny at higher ed and K through 12, and it needs to be done.
David, education as a focus to drive the economy, is that a wrong-headed approach?
No, it's a very wise approach, and I would argue that we've spent way too much money on trying to underwrite capital and not enough money on trying to underwrite the development of human skills, the education skills, the kind of skills that we believe are going to benefit us in economic growth. Yeah.
Another tax being debated at the State House is the state's gas tax, which people pay at the pump. There are those who are very much opposed to this. Mr. Goss, what's the relationship between infrastructure and economic growth and the gas tax? What's that relationship, and how does that function, and would raising the gas tax help?
Again, to say that I love a tax, but I'm supportive of a tax where you can identify here's where it's used and here's where you pay it. You see it when you pull that handle. You know what you're paying, or to some degree you know what you're paying. I'm not opposed to that when the money goes and the funds are going to support infrastructure. And the problem with using money from the general fund is it's hidden. And Dave, I'm sure, would agree. We like to see, if you're going to have pay cost taxes, have them up there so you can see them. So and infrastructure is vital. That would be highways, roads, and that also includes university and K through 12.
So you're saying that the increasing gas tax would not be an economic depressant?
All taxes to some degree are economic depressants, but the positive on the infrastructure side could outweigh that. In other words, having poor roads is not what you want in Iowa.
But Mr. Swenson, whenever folks talk about recession, they talk about energy costs and how that makes consumers very wary to make purchases in other areas because they're spending more on gas.
Right. If I just looked at the average Iowa commuter over the course of a year, a 10 cents increase in the gas tax would cost them a whopping about $32. So we're really not talking about a tax that's going to have a significant impact on your average household. But not having good roads, having roads that are in disrepair, hard on your cars, increases costs. But there's another part about the gas tax that needs to be talked about. Half that tax goes to local government. And so what's not being funded in the state of Iowa isn't just its state highway systems, but it's a very extensive and highly valuable rural highway system that is in bad shape.
Let's go back to a broadening of this issue. There's a lot of talk about alternative energy and that becoming a growing and important part of the state's economy. Is there potential there for wind, other alternative energy sources to be a significant economic driver in the state, or is that kind of around the fringes?
I'm somewhat opposed to industrial targeting. In other words, this policies of putting subsidies here. We've seen Solyndra, for example. Everyone's familiar with that. Of course, that's not wind energy.
That didn't work very well.
Didn't work very well. I think some of the support is probably good, but we then and supportive of the economy. But I think to deny the importance of fossil fuels and that the energy from that is wrong-headed. For example, natural gas is a tremendous potential right now. Yet we see our own energy department saying no to exports, or at least they're saying no to exports of natural gas because it might raise the price in the domestic market. Now that is just wrong-headed. We don't have an energy policy. By the way, we need an energy policy. That would be at the state level and more at the federal level, not an energy update. And we have policy of 2 months now. We have for example, the Social Security tax cut is a 2-month extension. Now, I don't know why everyone's not just bowling over laughing about that. I mean, that's comical. How could anybody think that's wise?
You've got to smile out of Mr. Swenson.
Mr. Swenson, the same question to you. Is alternative energy a potential driver?
It's going to be an important part of, we're diversifying all of Iowa's economy to include the incomes that are earned off of rural space. And alternative energy opportunities are one of those areas where more incomes are going to be made. But we have to recognize this. Iowa's 40 ethanol plants employ about 1,700 workers. That's about a Maytag spread across 40 different counties. The wind energy industry, they're putting them up, but it takes very few workers to maintain a lot of these. So in terms of job creation, they're not going to drive any sort of renaissance in rural areas. In terms of diversifying the income streams and helping to stabilize some of our rural space, it's going to be an important part of the economy in the future.
But a big tax generator. Those wind towers are big tax generators for the counties.
They can be. First of all, they abate those taxes usually for a schedule of about 7 years. And then when they come back in, they're taxed at about 30% of their net acquisition value. And they do become a new source of revenue for local governments, and a sorely needed source, because those windmills are often placed in counties that are losing the most people, their commerce is collapsing or contracting, and they're having trouble maintaining basic government services.
Gentlemen, you've both talked about the global nature of Iowa's economy. What happens if we get into a trade war with China? We have a Republican presidential candidate who has had some harsh words for the patent infringement that's going on in China. What happens to Iowa's economy if the door is closed to China, so to speak?
I would be shorting farm income or those companies that are linked to it, because that's absolutely a huge risk. Now, I'm not saying a trade war with China, I'm just saying anything, when you start restricting trade, it doesn't necessarily stop with China. It may move to South Korea, it could move on. And with China would be bad enough. I mean, you get into a trade war with China, it would not be pretty for China or the U.S. And I've seen a couple of our candidates talking about that, presidential candidates, and bashing China. Now, that may play well in the American elections. It's hard to win an election being pro-trade. It just is.
Mr. Swanson, same question to you.
Well, China is, by virtue of our manufacturing exports, I think it's our number 4 trading partner, but it's still important. And so it would have an impact here on China. You have to believe that the larger economy, the global economy, as well as those folks who really speak for business, they're not going to allow this rhetoric to get out of hand. I think that this is the kind of territory that you negotiate. You don't take absolute and hard stands.
But remember the embargo, Russian embargo in the 1980s, or 1980, of wheat embargo. It can get out of hand. I mean, I'm very concerned about that.
The thing I'm concerned about is time, and we're out of it. Thanks for a stimulating discussion.
It seemed like we just began. Thanks.
Thank you. Next week on Iowa Press, Iowa Senator Charles Grassley. He'll join us to discuss federal issues and the Republican presidential candidates. You'll see our conversation with Senator Grassley at 7:30 Friday night and our new time on Sunday at noon. I'm Dean Borg. Thanks for joining us today.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Iowa Gaming Association, on behalf of 18 commercial casino members who employ over 9,200 people with an annual payroll of more than $276 million and who generated nearly $1 billion for Iowa's economy in 2011.
Iowa Bankers Association. Iowa banks provide financial services to meet the needs of families, farms, and businesses. More information is available online at myiowabank.com. Iowa Banks, your future, our focus.
The Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure. Iowa Community Foundations, an initiative of the Iowa Council of Foundations, connecting donors to the causes and communities they care about. For good, for Iowa, forever. Details at iowacommunityfoundations.org.
The Rotary Clubs of Iowa and Rotary International.
In 1985, Rotary International committed to a goal of ending polio worldwide. Very soon now, after immunizing over 2 billion children, the goal will be achieved. Rotary, humanity in motion.
Iowa's hospitals provide jobs to 74,000 Iowans and have a $6.1 billion impact to the state's economy. Read more at www.ihaonline.org. The Iowa Hospital Association. We care about Iowa's health.
Iowa's private colleges and universities, enrolling 25% of the total Iowa higher education enrollment and conferring 44% of the baccalaureate and 40% of the graduate degrees in the state. More information is available at www.thinkindependently.com.